Hello, Psych 1100, how are you guys? Well, we think, here we go. In this particular lecturette, we're going to discuss personality, and certainly going to discuss it in brief compared to what's in your text. I'm not really going to talk a lot about personality theory or the wide array of personality theories and personality perspectives, if you will. So I'm going to hone in more specifically on the more cognitive aspect of personality that is really reflects the trait and the type approaches. So a lot of historic information is left out of this lecture on personality, but you did have that in your text. So and notice that I've shortened this down quite a bit just to handle types and traits within the context of our assignment. So an average personality lecture like for psychology of adjustment, if I do a personality lecture, it's probably got like somewhere between 70 and 80 PowerPoints because it's a broad topic. It's an area of psychology in and of itself. Ohio State has a course in the psychology of personality, an entire course. So, it becomes tough in deciding what we're going to talk about and what we're not going to talk about. But in this case, let's start with a simple definition. It's a person's general style of interacting with the world, and especially with other people, given that we're social animals, right? Now, a trait is a relatively stable predisposition to behave in a certain way. So a trait is a much narrower concept than is personality. And talk about Mrs. Personality. What are you doing? Huh? Have you been waiting for this moment all weekend? Okay, so here we go. Penelope's going to help us through this one. And type, especially important dimensions or clusters of traits that are not only central to a person's personality, but are found with essentially the same pattern in many people. That is kind of a categorization of people based on a constellation of traits. And it's funny, when my mom was still with us, and her cat Lexi, who is still with us even past my mom's passing, we would sometimes, talk about the cats and what they were doing and how they differ. And my mom would always say the same thing, well, cats, they have their own little personalities, don't they? And I mean, it was kind of trite because you hear it about 1,017 times, but it is true. And so the notion of animals having personality, humans having personality, these are differences, but it manifests itself primarily in observable behaviors, right? And one's a general being in the world. So trait theories, right, specify a manageable distinct personality dimensions that can be used to summarize kind of psychological difference between individuals. Cattell pioneered trait theory with a basic approach, with a trait theory approach, and he had 16 basic traits. And that becomes part of the argument. Well, how many traits are important? I mean, we might be able to list really kind of almost an infinite number of traits, but ultimately, what we want to try to do, in interpersonal relations, is predict someone's behavior. Let's take a simple trait like greedy. So if we describe a person as being greedy, what does that let us know? It lets us know that they're unlikely to loan us money. And if they do, then they might charge interest. I certainly wouldn't think of getting gifts or expensive gifts from a greedy person. I don't expect them to donate to charity, right? And I don't expect them to share their dinner with me. So that's what greed allows us to do, is once we label a person as greedy, then we can predict their behavior in subsequent interactions. This is the value of traits, and whether they're clinically deduced or whether it's just through our naive experience of other people or naive psychology. But are some traits more important than others? And this is a big question that Cattell was asking and attempting to answer. He developed, among others, the idea of factor analysis. And the use of factor analysis then allows us to look at correlations between different measures and then on a given set of individuals, and it allows us to then discern that maybe certain items within a scale that we take cluster together, and then they represent concepts in terms of traits. So it's the study factor analysis of a pattern of correlations. Now, for example, I've been working with some students on what we call the predator measure, and we're, advancing the idea that predatory behavior, that predation is a trait. and some of us are low in predation instincts, some of us are high in predation, and some obviously are in the middle. It's somehow distributed. And we've been developing a questionnaire over the years, just chipping away at it, mostly for the research fun, if you believe that. And the current questionnaire, the Predator Measure number 3, has 108 questions. Now, what we can do is we can correlate all 108 questions to each of the 108 questions, and we'll notice that certain questions seem to correlate highly, and other questions don't correlate at all. And the questions that correlate highly probably then represent the same concept. That is, those questions are assessing maybe the same theoretical phenomenon, the same construct. So factor analysis allows us to study questionnaires, and kind of the simple terminology is what hangs together and what doesn't. And that allows us to maybe reduce a 108 item questionnaire to representing 3 or 4 different subcomponents of predation. That's just an example, right? And when we look at this matrix of correlation among adjectives used as personality self-description, it gives us an understanding of the relationship between traits. And let's focus on rude. If we go down the first column, down almost to the bottom, we see rude. And then if we go across, we see kind. And we see the intersection of rude and kind should, in fact, demonstrate a negative relationship. And the correlation is, in fact, negative, strongly, too, minus 0.65. So this allows us then to understand the relationship between traits and identify traits within questionnaires. But let's answer that question, and let's start getting to your assignment. The Big Five model or factor model of personality. You say Big Five? Well, what we found, people have found through just a tremendous amount of research, factor analysis, and then testing for predictive validity of the traits, that a person's personality is probably most efficiently described, right, in terms of a score on 5 relatively independent global trait dimensions. And how do we know they're independent? Because when we subject them to correlational analysis via factor analysis, what we see is these really are separate constructs, that they don't have high intercorrelations in between them. And so we have openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So the definitions, and of course you have a copy of this so you can see it. The neuroticism stability dimension is to what extent do people suffer emotional distress, or is their emotional life somewhat labile, that is changeable, right? And to what extent might ideas, urges, etc., kind of predominate their over their ability to inhibit them, right? So the low end, what we see is people who are emotionally stable, they don't get upset easily, and are not generally prone to depression. Now, the high end, right, what we see is many forms of emotional distress might be present. So how laid back or how uptight is somebody is maybe a correlate to this, but not an exact definition. Now, extroversion introversion, and I'm going to differ a little bit in that I think extroversion introversion really represents a cognitive style. Now, I'm a relatively high extrovert, and when I discuss ideas, when I think about things, I love to share ideas with other people. I love to have a conversation. So notice with extroversion, a lot of my thought process takes place outside of me. So I toss an idea out there, and then we consume that idea together, and we go round and round in discussing it. And then eventually, as things are decided, as awareness increases in this external space, then it comes back inside. So extroverts often find themselves in places where they can speak to other people. They seek these places out because it's where they think most comfortably, right? I love to collaborate on research because there's nothing more fun than discussing ideas with other people. So you can see I'm a pretty strong extrovert in that a lot of my thinking process most successfully takes place outside of the self. Now, introverts, on the other hand, need alone time. They need to process internally, right? So they're more likely to regard the internal processes and internal voices, so that they need that alone time. They need that quiet time. They need that time free of distraction. So where I may be comfortable in my office hours with 4 or 5 people discussing the predatory trait measure, an introvert more likely needs to process that information in their own quiet time. So behaviorally, what do we expect to see? Extroverts seek out places where they can be with other people. Introverts tend to seek out at least a certain amount of time where they can be by themselves and do their process most effectively. Notice, I am really kind of trying to pitch a difference here that kind of erases the stigma of introversion, because a lot of people, think that introversion is less than extroversion, and I don't buy it. I really think it's just a difference in how we prefer to process information. So, my take on introversion, extroversion, right? But notice the behavioral aspects. What do we see? We expect to see extroverts out there among people. We see introverts more in private settings. Okay. Now, openness to experience, non-openness, right? Well, people are high in openness to new experience. They want to try new things. They are not as put off by anxiety of the unknown, right? So they're more willing to embrace that or to experiment with it. So if a new restaurant opens up in town, the people who are high in openness to experience say, hey, when they're asked, where do you want to go to dinner? They say, we should try that new place, right? Because they're open to that new experience. Or we should try this new type of food. Now, on the low end, openness, that is, and it's less open to new experience, which means we prefer traditional experiences. It's correlated to a certain degree with conservatism, right? But familiarity is preferred over novelty. Okay. And notice, openness, again, is often thought to be, or stereotyped as being good, and closed is stereotyped as being bad. But you can see where both have benefits. Traditional way of thinking and traditional approach, and the respect for traditions, and then the exploration that is implied by openness. Right? Now, agreeable and antagonism. Here, what do you think is more important? To get along or to just put it out there the way it is, right? And people who are high in agreeableness then tend to avoid conflict, and they want to put a premium on agreement more so than necessarily an exploration of conflicting sides. Now, antagonistic, right? We see then people tend to be antagonistic and hostile, which is certainly a negative aspect and might fight for the sake of fighting. Here we see that the sweet spot on this particular scale of the Big Five, the sweet spot is probably right in the middle. That is, I'm willing to state my views and opinions, I'm willing to explore ideas, and I'm willing to do so in an honest manner. Often overly agreeable people are inherently somewhat dishonest because they don't want to bring up things that might offend other people. So they may in fact conceal information or conceal their opinions. And then conscientiousness. Certainly what we're talking about now is people who are conscientious, they can be relied upon, right? They have a pretty good level of control over their own processes. They usually have pretty strong inhibitory powers to impulse control, right? And then when we see that the low end, they have a hard time maybe keeping a schedule, right? They're undirected, they're disorganized, they can even manifest in unreliable behaviors. So conscientiousness, you can see, is pretty important. You're probably going to do well to get through school if you're higher on the conscientious rather than the undirected end, right? So the Big Five, over time, has been established as kind of the model, the trait model of personality. What traits are most important? The Big Five. Why do we call them the Big Five? Because they're the most important, right? So one advantage to being like the top dog on the block, that is the Big Five model of personality, is that people tend to use it. researchers tend to use it to predict behavior in myriad situations. So they'll say, well, how does the Big Five predict workplace behavior? How does the Big Five predict school behavior? How does the Big Five predict relationship behavior, right? So it's become kind of the standard, and this is why I want you to take the Big Five, right? So these questionnaires, and it's also known as the NEO, but we can't do the NEO. The NEO has to be administered by people who are clinically licensed. They have to purchase it from the company that owns it. It's copyrighted. They have to purchase it. They have to demonstrate their licensure within a state. So I could not give legitimately the Big Five. We use the Big Five in some research to predict the relationship Big Five to certain aspects of creativity, and we used to give it to our psycho-creativity students in class. But the thing is, I couldn't give it in class. Even though I'm the teacher of the class, I can't give the Big Five because it has to be done by a licensed clinician. So I would bring someone in to do it. But fear not, there are all kinds of versions out there of the Big Five, and I'd like you to go to the website listed here, out of service, and what it is, it's a good Big Five test. How do I know it's a good Big Five test? Because I've taken the Big Five, the legit one, right, and I've taken the online version, and the scores line up perfectly, right? So good version of this test. And let me say this about online tests. There's no guarantee that just because a test is labeled as a test and it's online, that it's a decent version of it. So that's why I'm going to steer you towards versions that I have double-checked, right? I've seen are consistent with legitimate versions of the test. So you can go ahead, and that's one of the first parts of the assignment. You're going to test yourself on the Big Five, and then record your scores, and then reflect upon them. This will give you a pretty good report here. And another nice feature is it's free, right? So not all personality tests online are free, as I'm sure you have found out. One of the questions I'm going to ask you to answer is how valid are personality tests, but a little more on that later. Let's take another look at a trait. Look at this. One of the new traits that's very popular now is called grit. And grit's been around for a long time. Before it was grit, it was called persistence, diligence. There's a lot of names for grit, right? One of my favorite names, although it's too long, so it's not going to win out because grit's cool to say, was stick-to-itiveness, right? And what we see is people who stick to it end up with higher creativity output, right? And better job performance because they stick to it. They got grit, right? And especially if you start throwing obstacles at people with grit, they work hard to surmount, to bypass, to circumvent those obstacles. Now, Duckworth and his colleagues proposed this higher order trait. Remember, one of the first traits that was ever measured, and we talked about this, was intelligence. And we could argue, is intelligence a personality trait? Or is it a cognitive trait? And maybe that's a discussion that doesn't get us anywhere anyway. But if we want to predict success, what they found was that IQ, intelligence quotient, wasn't a very good predictor of success in a lot of domains. What was a better predictor of success was perseverance, that is, or renamed grit. So this is perseverance and also combines a passion for long-term goals. And notice, if we create a questionnaire that focuses on perseverance, like 5 questions that really tap into perseverance, but 5 questions that tap more into passion, factor analysis would allow us to say, hey, these 5 questions seem to hang together. These 5 questions seem to hang together. Let's read those questions, and wow, these 5 questions seem like they're talking more about perseverance. These 5 questions seem to be talking about something else, maybe something that we will call passion, right? So that's how factor analysis kind of fits into it. So perseverance of effort, but consistency of interest becomes important too. Because you know people who jump in with both feet to learn something new, but they get tired of it rapidly and it goes away. Now, let's compare it to the Dark Triad because we have to be able to explain bad behavior. And psychopathy has been one trait level. Psychopathy is kind of one typology, right, that relies on the assessment of multiple traits to explain, let's say, criminal or antisocial behavior. Well, researchers have identified people with socially aversive personalities as scoring high in what is called the Dark Triad of personality traits. So let's suppose that I am interviewing applicants for a position, and this might be a position of trust. It might be handling a lot of money, or handling sensitive information about people, or interacting with vulnerable people. I might want to screen out people who are high in the Dark Triad. I just don't want these people interacting with vulnerable clients because they might take advantage of them or do even worse, right? So the Dark Triad looks at three components of personality: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. Narcissism is that grandiose sense of self-worth. That is, I am bitchin' and I'm entitled to all the good in the world, and if it hurts other people, alas, too bad for them, right? Now, Machiavellianism goes back to 1970s. Christian Geist actually wrote the book on Machiavellianism in the 1970s, and they developed the Mach scale, which was to assess someone's level of Machiavellianism. This is where a person is predisposed and believes it is A-OK to manipulate others, that they believe manipulation is just an okay interpersonal tactic. Now, psychopathy, right, is amoral, antisocial behavior coupled with lack of empathy and inability to create meaningful relationships. This, but much bigger than that, as it's currently thought. So 10, 15 years ago, the Dark Triad is gaining some big traction. They're saying, look at the Dark Triad, look at how this explains so many bad people and their behavior. But over time, we start looking at it and said, there's something lacking in the Dark Triad, and believe it or not, then what's afoot when something's lacking in the Dark Triad? Well, the development of, or the evolution of the Dark Tetrad, which adds in a fourth component. So narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy fail to fully explain the observed behavior. What was the observed behavior that was not being explained? That was the intent to harm others, to out and out harm others and take pleasure in harming others. Well, we've got a trait that pretty much sums that up, and it's called sadism. So now we have this kind of typology called the Dark Tetrad, but you see it's the compilation of scores on numerous traits. So traits are thought to be the foundation element, right? And then the typology is the larger. So let's break it right now, and we'll come back to part